So I have a couple of core foundational values, and they're not things that I explicitly developed. They're just sort of, you can look back after the fact and say, oh yeah, I won't compromise on those things. But now I realize how important honesty is. And I learned that from a couple of different places. One is when I grew up, I wanted to be a physicist, and I idolized Richard Feynman. I read everything by him, technical and non-technical, that I could get my hands on. And he said, you must never, ever fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So the physics grounding is very important, because physics, you have to speak truth. You don't compromise. You don't negotiate with people. You don't try and make them feel better, because if your equation is wrong, it just won't work, whatever you're doing. So I think the science background is important in that. A second is growing up in New York. I grew up around some really rough and tumble kids, some of who were actually the Russian mob. And I once had an encounter where I watched one of them threaten to kill the other. And the would-be victim, went and hid. And then finally he let the aggressor into his house after the aggressor promised him, no, I'm not going to kill you. Their honesty was such a strong virtue between them that even when they were ready to kill each other, they would take each other's word for things. It sort of went above everything. And even though it was honesty in a mob context, I realized how important that is in relationships. And then as I get older in life, I realized that a lot of happiness is just being present. And whether you get this out of Buddhism or cognitive therapy or drugs or wherever, you realize that to live in the present moment is the highest calling. It's the source of all happiness. And when you're not honest with somebody else, or when you even withhold something in your mind, what you've done is you've created a second thought process. You've created a second thread in your head that then has to stay active, keeping track of what you've said versus what you're really thinking. And that takes you out of the moment, and it brings you unhappiness over time. You will not realize it at that moment itself, but it will create stress and distraction. So if you really want to be happy, you have to be present. And one of the core tenets of being present is to be completely honest at all times.
There is a great short book that had a huge impact on me on this topic called Lying by Sam Harris, which was just phenomenal because it explored the impact not just of lying in the way that most people think of it, but generalized deceit or even white lies that are intended to protect people. And just to come back to Feynman also, Feynman is a character and a thinker who I've long idolized in many ways. Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman. It's one of my favorite books. And even for non-technical people, I think he's someone worth exploring. And if you're not the reading type, you could just search for a video. I think it was done on Nova ages ago called The Joy of Finding Things Out, which is it gives you such a taste of Feynman and the way that he not only, I think, questioned the so-called obvious or best practices, but also explored being a polymath, right? I mean, even though he was a world-class physicist, he was also an amateur safecracker and pickup artist and musician, in other ways. Really fascinating guy.